to the western coast of Africa, so it made sense for them to start first, and they were the farthest away from the trading networks. And they also had a member of the royal family who was very interested in navigation. So Prince Henry sponsored schools for navigation, which led to the development of the technology that was necessary for exploration. They developed the ships, the caravel, which were integrating Asian and Middle Eastern navigational technology, and they were very fast and small and able to traverse coastal waters. And so the caravel became the primary ship of the Portuguese in this time period. The astrolabe, cartography, they developed better knowledge of how to rely on the winds and the water patterns to progress. So the Portuguese are going to be the first to explore the western coast of Africa. In doing so, they will start to establish relationships with West African kingdoms. At first, they will discover the opportunity to trade for gold. And then later, once plantation agriculture becomes a thing, they will start to trade for slaves. So starting with Vasco da Gama, the Portuguese are first to reach the Indian Ocean via a route that goes around the southern tip of Africa. When they get to the Indian Ocean, they basically discover that the goods that they have to offer for trade are not at all interesting to the Arabs or the Indians or the Chinese in the network. And so then the Portuguese undertake what we call gunboat diplomacy to try to take control of some coastal territory, build military forts, and then attempt to dominate trade by exercising monopolies in certain regions. They're not totally in control of the Indian Ocean at this point. The Chinese are still supreme in terms of their power in the region, but they do gain some control over limited networks. The next to explore are the Spanish. And the Spanish have this idea that they can sail west and get to the Indian Ocean more quickly. In the process, of course, they run into new land, which is the New World. And so the impact then of Columbus's travels is that Portugal and Spain now have to negotiate between each other what the rules are going to be, and they enter into an agreement with the help of the Pope called the Treaty of Tordesillas. The Treaty of Tordesillas divides the world between Spain and Portugal, Spain claiming the West, primarily the Americas, and Portugal claiming the East because their primary focus was on maintaining their presence and dominance in the Indian Ocean, as well as Brazil. Next in the age of exploration are the Dutch. And the Dutch become interested, like the Portuguese, in the Indian Ocean trading network, and they will largely replace the Portuguese in terms of control. So the Dutch are going to oust the Portuguese militarily. The Dutch are also actually preferred by countries like Japan, who don't like the influence of the Jesuit missionaries who come along with the Portuguese traders. And the Dutch, being Protestant, aren't as interested in conversion. Following the Dutch, the French and the British will get in on the exploration game. The French will target trying to find a northwest passage over the Americas to get to the Indian Ocean unsuccessfully. However, that will lead them to then settle much of the territory of northern Canada. The British will focus both on the Americas and also on expanding their influence in the Indian Ocean. Ultimately, the British will be the most successful and will largely oust the Portuguese and the Dutch in terms of maintaining control of the Indian Ocean. Okay, we talked about the French already. So there you go. So one of the big impacts of all this exploration is the Columbian Exchange. And the Columbian Exchange is the exchange of plants, animals, disease, people, ideas that go from the old world to the new and vice versa. So if we focus in on some of the key aspects of the Columbian Exchange, disease was probably the biggest impact, and smallpox was the disease that really decimated the American populations and greatly facilitated the ability of the Europeans to colonize those regions. In addition, some of the foodstuffs that went from the New World to the Old that were very transformative were potatoes, maize or corn, and manioc, which really improved greatly the diet of the Europeans as well as the Africans, and increased population in those regions. The cultivation of cash crops in the Americas also led to the involuntary migration of Africans into the Americas, and so that greatly changed the demographic makeup of the Americas. Also want to mention the animals that were transported from the old world to the new. As you might remember, the populations of the old world didn't really have, the populations of the new world didn't really have beasts of burden other than the Incans who had llamas. And so horses, cattle, pigs, all of these animals were really transformative. Horses for transportation, for warfare, for labor. Cattle also important in terms of the geography of the region. And so one of the things we want to remember about the Columbian Exchange is not only did the introduction of these animals dramatically change the lifestyles of the people, it also greatly impacted the environment. These are all graze animals. They need vast amounts of land. And so the introduction of animals, the cultivation of cash crops, all of these things serve to negatively impact the American environment in terms of deforestation and soil depletion. Okay, let me check over here and make sure. All right, so y'all are hearing me, and so far I don't see any questions being asked, so I'm just going to continue. So what develops then as part of this Columbian Exchange is a new trading network, and that is the Atlantic Trading System, or sometimes we call it the Triangular Trading Network. You can see that from Europe, what's going from England to Africa, manufactured goods, rum, etc., to exchange for slaves, and then what's going to America and to Africa in this triangle. I'm not going to kind of belabor that point. I think you guys know it. So now what I want to talk a little bit about are the colonial empires that were developed by the Europeans in the Americas, starting with the Spanish. One of the generalizations to remember is there's a lot of commonality between what the Spanish did with their colonial empire in the Americas and also what the Portuguese did. But focusing in on the Spanish first, the Spanish governed their colonies directly, and they established viceroyalties in the Americas. These were governors who came from Spain and were directly answerable to the crown, and the theory was that they were being directly governed. All of the viceroys were people who were born in Spain. One of the things that happened in the Spanish colonies, however, was that there was a lot of integration of the native populations into the Spanish colonial empires. This was different than what we saw in the British colonial empires, where the Native Americans were much smaller in population and were basically pushed off of the land. But the Spanish are conquering complex civilizations, the Incans and the Aztecs, that are largely populated, and so they're going to integrate the populations. So what develops in the Spanish colonies is a new social hierarchy and kind of different racial ideologies. So we talked about how the Peninsulares were at the top, and those are the folks that came from Spain. Their children born in the Americas are the Creole, and the Creole became the upper middle class, largely serving in the military and having prominent business interests in the Americas. The Creole will be the leaders of our revolutions in the next unit. Then beneath the Creoles were mixed races where there was intermarriage, and so the mestizo Native American, the mestizos are the Spanish Native Americans, and the mulattoes are the Spanish Africans, and they were the traditional middle class. Beneath those classes were the Native American population, and then the African slave population. So a much more complex social hierarchy developed in the Spanish colonial empires. The Spanish also utilized some unique labor systems, two of which are the encomienda and the mita. The encomienda was essentially feudalism transported to the Americas. So to encourage Spanish settlers in the Spanish colonial territory, large manors or tracts of land, haciendas, were given to people who were willing to settle, and then the peasants who lived on the land became the indentured servants, or the serfs, if you will, of the system, and they had labor obligations to the encomendero. One of the other unique labor systems utilized by the Spanish is the mita. And the mita was an Incan labor system that was designed to have the community contribute labor for public work projects like the Incan roads, terraced farming, or monumental architecture that was built. What the Spanish did was they utilized that same draft system, but they sent the people to work in the silver mines. And that had pretty dramatic impact on the Incan population. The work in the silver mines was dangerous. A lot of people died or were injured. There was high levels of mercury poisoning that occurred. The draft became increasingly burdensome and oppressive, and it really altered the populations of the native villages and had some devastating effects on them. Okay, let me get back. So while we're talking about the colonial empires, let's now kind of shift over to the other Europeans. So the Portuguese in Brazil predominantly established a viceroyalty like the Spanish, so they kind of modeled direct rule in their colonial territory. Their focus, however, there was essentially plantation agriculture, particularly sugarcane cultivation. So really the social hierarchy in those colonies was essentially a few planter whites, and then a large population of African slaves. And so the Portuguese were the first to rely heavily on African slaves and to institute the plantation cash crop agricultural system. In the British colonies in North America, government was a little bit different in that the colonial governments were given opportunities for self-rule. So charters were issued, constitutional assemblies were elected, governors were elected, and so they really were quite varied in their governmental structure. The British also experimented with a different labor system than the others, and that was indentured servitude. So to allow people in debt and to relieve some of the population pressure in England, they allowed people to come over to the Americas after signing a contract that obligated them for 7 years of labor, after which they could then seek an opportunity for a new life in the New World. However, over time, the British discovered that African slavery, which was a much more prosperous and consistent, sustainable source of labor, so they abandoned indentured servitude in favor of African slavery in the regions where they practiced plantation agriculture. One thing to remember about the British colonies, however, is that they had a much more varied economy, plantation agriculture in the South, but farming, farming that they actually consumed in the middle states, and then in the north they had fishing and shipping and other kinds of industries that supported the economies of the north. Okay, so let me back and check. I'm going to pause for a second. Does anybody have a question or want to say anything to me? Okay, everybody's still alive, right? Okay, this is weird that I can't see you. So let's talk a little bit about the African slave trade, and specifically the impact on the West African regions. So the Europeans established relationships with the kingdoms that were on the coastline that were willing to participate in the sale of slaves. This gave a lot of power and wealth to these African kings, who were able to largely set the terms of exchange. So European traders would have to do ceremonies. They were briefed on particular items that were to be demanded. I think you guys remember we read an article when we did our labor systems about how you kind of had to maybe buy less desirable slaves to make a positive relationship with the king, so that you could then do future business. So there was definitely a lot of bargaining power on the side of the Africans who did engage in the slave trade. Most of the slaves, as we talked about today, were going to the Caribbean for purposes of plantation agriculture. One of the key items that came out of all of this was silver. And so as we talked about, the mina was utilized for silver, and then silver became a major commodity in the Columbian Exchange and had impacts globally on all parts of the world. So silver came out of the Potosi mines in the Incan Empire, and then also silver mines were discovered in Mexico as well. And so silver, the influx of silver had a huge benefit to the Europeans. Most of the Europeans were then able to utilize that silver to acquire items in global trade. In the case of the Spanish, they didn't manage the influx of silver very well, so the silver ended up causing a lot of economic decline in Spain. But in the Ottoman, the Safavid, and the Mughal empires, the influx of silver created inflationary problems, as it did in China as well. The overarching economic policy of all of this is mercantilism. And mercantilism is the idea that the most powerful European country is the European country with the most wealth. And so the purpose of colonies, the purpose of dominating trade routes was to facilitate the wealth of the motherland. And so the goal in the colonies was to extract as much gold and silver, as much wealth as possible for the benefit of the crown. To do this, countries like England and like the Dutch utilized joint stock companies as a mechanism to control the economies of their colonies and also to establish monopolies on trade. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about, and these slides kind of mirror some of the standards. It's not mine. I just want to give you something to look at. But let's talk a little bit about what's happening in Europe in general. So this is the time period of the rise of absolute monarchies. We're coming out of a feudal period. Feudalism is declining in part because of the economic revival that took place after the Crusades and the expansion of trade. And kind of a commercial revolution, if you will. It's also a factor of a lot of internal conflict in Europe, and warfare justifies monarchs in raising armies. It also justifies monarchs to levy national taxes. And so little by little, the monarchs are centralizing power in Europe. Another factor that's helping them to centralize power is the Reformation and the decline of the power of the church. So the Reformation takes place in 1517, starting with Martin Luther, a Catholic priest who opposes the corrupt practices of the church, particularly the sale of indulgences, which are pardons for sin. So Martin Luther calls for a reform in the church. He wants the church to address these abuses and these corruptions. He posts his 95 complaints against the church on the door of the Wittenberg church. And lo and behold, the church is not interested in reform. So Martin Luther is excommunicated. He is sentenced to death. And then you have what is the second split in the Christian church. The first split was a split between Roman Catholicism and Eastern Orthodoxy. And now we have a second split, which is between Roman Catholicism and Protestantism. Martin Luther, in hiding, is able to establish the first Protestant faith, Lutheranism. And the most important concept of Lutheranism is salvation by faith. The idea that you don't need the institution of the church, you don't have to practice the sacraments, you ought to be able to read the Bible in your own language. All you need is to have faith in order to be saved. Different Protestant denominations will emerge based on this concept of salvation by faith. One of the other prominent Protestant sects in Europe at this time is Calvinism. And Calvinism adds the idea of predestination. As monarchs use the Reformation to split from the church to increase their power, other Protestant churches are established. For example, Henry VIII splits from the church and establishes the Church of England, or the Anglican religion. So the Reformation is a mechanism for monarchies to increase their power. The Catholic Church does respond to the Reformation and try to maintain the power and wealth of the Catholic Church, and they do this in a couple of ways. They meet at the Council of Trent, where they vehemently reaffirm their doctrine. They decide to utilize Inquisition courts to stamp out heresy, meaning Protestants, throughout Europe. They use censorship to discourage contrary ideas. They establish the Jesuit order of missionaries who are going to try to maintain Catholicism in Europe and also all around the globe as colonial territories are established. And sorry, I just lost my train of thought. They do all of this to try to maintain the influence and power of the Catholic Church. The end result is essentially that Catholicism remains dominant in Southern Europe. However, Protestantism starts to become more dominant in Northern Europe. The other big picture end result of all this is a lot of warfare is fought over the next 200 years between Protestants and Catholics as monarchs are jockeying to try to gain control and power over one another, and these wars are often fought in the name of religion. One of the major wars was the 30 Years' War, which was between the Protestants and the Catholics in the Holy Roman Empire, as the Holy Roman Emperor tried to unify all of the German states together under Catholicism, but failed and was unable to do so. The monarchs will use monumental architecture in Europe to try to legitimate and consolidate their rule. A good example of that is the Palace of Versailles by Louis XIV, where he essentially demonstrated his power as the Sun King and also was able to maintain control of the nobles by keeping them at court. You see on the slide the picture of the Taj Mahal. That's an example from the Mughal Empire of rulers trying to legitimate their power. All right, so we've talked about these various empires. You don't really need to know specific monarchs and details in Europe, but you want to know the general trends of what's happening, how they're starting to centralize their bureaucracies. Most of the European monarchs are courting the business class against the nobles, and so they're integrating more and more middle class into staffing that bureaucracy to try to gain a support base to increase their power. They're all using mercantilism as their economic philosophy, which affects things overseas, but also seeks to protect trade at home using tariffs and other protective measures. They all have a state religion. However, some of them are more tolerant than others in terms of allowing for other Christian faiths within their empire. So let's now turn our attention to some of the land-based empires. Let me make sure that I don't see any questions. I'm alive, I think. Hey, Jared. Okay, so I got what are joint stock companies? So let me stop and answer that, and then we'll start talking about the Gunpowder Empires. So joint stock companies are private corporations that are issued charters from the crown. And so that means that everyday people like you and me can invest in the joint stock company, and that joint stock company has been given exclusive trading rights, essentially a monopoly on trade in a particular region, or exclusive rights to a port city that the European country controls in the Indian Ocean. The reason the monarchs did this was it helped to limit their risk in exploration and trade, because bad things happened. Ships sank, treasures were lost, and that way the monarchs weren't solely financing all of this risk. So you and I could earn a profit by investing in these companies, but because these were royal charters, the monarchy also got a big profit from the actions of these joint stock companies. And the joint stock companies also served to restrict trade so that colonies were limited and could only trade with their mother empire. They couldn't trade with others. Okay, so let me go back to let's get back to talking about the land-based empires. So, whoops, I hit something accidentally. Let me close that. So one of the big themes in this unit is kind of the contrast between what's happening with sea-based empires versus what's happening with land-based empires. And I think you kind of have seen in our discussion about the Europeans the benefits of having a sea-based empire. You can get access to resources that you don't have at home. Most of them utilized forced labor systems, so basically free or very cheap labor to get the resources they needed. It gave them strategic military outposts and dominance of trade. So obviously lots of advantages to being a sea-based empire. So by the end of this time period, the empires that were land-based, those that only expanded from where they were, are going to be at a distinct disadvantage. The land-based empires are the Muslim gunpowder empires, the Chinese empires, and the Russian Empire. So let's kind of talk about the gunpowder empires first. So big picture generalization that you want to remember about all three. They're all established by Turkic nomadic groups. All are Islamic. They all understand that they have to integrate gunpowder to be able to expand their territory and to thrive. So all of them are going to do some form of the devshirme, like the Ottomans utilized to try to integrate Christians into or foreigners into their military to have that gunpowder experience, because the Turkic warriors are horseback and they use bow and arrow. They're all going to really thrive predominantly in the late 15th through the 16th centuries and have a golden age, and this is the time period of Suleiman in the Ottoman Empire, Shah Abbas in the Safavid Empire, and Akbar the Great in the Mughal Empire. So they're going to have centralized bureaucracy, largely using foreigners in the government, so the local people that they have conquered. They're going to be for the most part, tolerant towards non-Muslims, and so they'll have a great deal of achievement during these time periods. They all are going to use land grants to try to maintain the loyalty of the aristocracy. And then coming into the 17th century, they're all going to experience a period of decline for similar reasons. We talked a little bit about the sultanates having a problem with how they handle succession. And so a lack of a clear successor led ultimately to poor leadership. They aren't innovative. They're relying on the innovations of the Europeans, and they all have a problem with inflation due to the influx of New World silver. So in various ways, they're going to lose control of trade to the Europeans. The Ottomans are going to have to grant the Europeans concessions. The Safavids are just literally not going to be able to compete because they're landlocked really, and they don't have any kind of naval power. The Mughals are going to start losing territory to the British East India Company as they start to establish port cities. So all of them are going to lose control of their trade little by little to the Europeans. All right, let's talk. Let's look specifically at the map of the Ottomans really quickly. So the Ottomans are going to be the longest lasting of the Islamic gunpowder empires, the most powerful and the largest. And that has to do with location. So they get that critical area around the Mediterranean. Okay, can y'all still hear me? Everybody okay? Can y'all still hear me? Can anyone hear me? Christine can hear me. Jared, I think it's just you.
Yeah, I think we can all hear you.
I think it's just Jared. Okay, sorry. It's so weird just talking to a computer. Are y'all liking this? I'm feeling weird. Okay, let me go back. Okay. So the Ottoman Empire really starts to flourish once they conquer Constantinople in 1453, and that marks the end of the Byzantine Empire. And that enables them to then expand into Eastern Europe. So once they're able to do that, and then they are literally controlling the trade from the Black Sea into the Mediterranean Sea. Okay. Okay. All right, let me stop for a second because I'm hearing an echo. All right, the Ottomans are the only ones of the gunpowder that really have any navy of significance, And so they're going to effectively utilize their navy against the Venetians, and they're going to jockey for control of Mediterranean sea trade for a period of time, and they're going to be successful. Once they start to enter their period of decline, part of what ushers that in is the Spanish Armada is utilized by Philip II to help the Venetians regain control of the Mediterranean, and so the Ottomans will lose control, and that's one of the things that will signify their decline. So unique to the Ottomans, of course, was the Devshirme system that they established to generate a military corps that was able to integrate gunpowder. So they levied a tax on the Christian communities for their children, and their children were trained by the Sultan, educated in Islam, and became the elite fighting force of the Ottoman Empire. Some of them also became high-ranking bureaucrats in the Ottoman Empire. The main leader to know from the Ottoman Empire is Suleiman the Magnificent. Suleiman established a very effective centralized bureaucracy where he had a council of advisors right underneath his Grand Vizier. And we talked about in class the religious tolerance, and so there was kind of two sides to the government. There were religious communities known as millets, and each of those religious communities had an opportunity for direct representation and to bring matters to the attention of the Sultan. There was also the centralized bureaucracy itself that administered tax collection, the military, and kind of the day-to-day operations of the government. Under Suleiman, there was also a great deal of architectural achievement. So he built a number of mosques and so on that are still kind of tourist attractions today. So that's kind of the main thing to remember about the Ottomans. I don't have an image of, we'll stay up here for a second. I don't have an image of the Safavids specifically, but the Safavids are directly to the east of the Ottomans, and they are Shia Muslim. That's the main distinction to know about the Safavids. The Safavids are similar to the Ottomans in many ways, but one of their primary challenges was they didn't have a naval power, and their capital city was pretty far inland, so they didn't have the same ability to dominate trade. However, being on the Silk Road, they did have a good demand for their textiles, particularly the Persian rugs that were silk and were heavily sought after. So for a period of time, the Safavids, like the Ottomans, will experience a golden age. Trade will be flourishing, and we'll see some beautiful architecture that integrates both Persian and Arabic styles. Once the Europeans start to become more dominant in trade, that's going to decline for the Safavids. Because they're Shia, they come into conflict with the Ottomans. So warfare between the Shia and between the Safavids and the Ottomans is also going to weaken those empires. All right, let me bring up the Mughals, the last of our Gunpowder Empire. So the most important thing to remember about the Mughals is that they are a Muslim minority governing a large Hindu majority. And so the focus of the early Mughal rulers was how to create an environment of peaceful coexistence. And so under the leadership of people like Akbar the Great, tolerant policies were established. And so unlike the other Muslim gunpowder empires where additional taxes were levied on non-Muslims, Akbar the Great got rid of the discriminatory taxes. So the Hindus did not pay extra taxes because they were not Muslim. He also encouraged intermarriage, and he himself married a Hindu princess. Many of the Hindus were placed in high positions in the government, and he tried to institute this religion that was going to be a combination of Hinduism, Sikhism, but Islam, all of the faiths of the region he tried to combine into this divine faith. Divine faith didn't really survive him, but his policies did. After Akbar the Great, however, subsequent Mughal rulers like Shah Jahan built elaborate things like the Taj Mahal and were frivolous in their spending. In addition, once the Mughal Empire stopped expanding, they started to have economic pressures, and then the arrival of the Europeans and competition for trade made that economic pressure worse. So later Mughal emperors are going to reverse the policies of tolerance. starting with Aurangzeb, and so the taxes are going to be re-levied on the Hindus, and that's going to create tension between the Mughals and the Hindu population that they serve. Let me check in and see if we've got questions right now. Everybody good? Yes. Was he tolerant? Are you asking about Akbar the Great? He was tolerant. I'm hoping that was your question. Oh, yes. The Ottomans were tolerant, particularly towards Jews and Christians, because they were other peoples of the book. And as I was kind of showing you with the slide on with the bureaucracy, millets were religious communities that were allowed to be self-governing. So as long as what the policy didn't conflict with, the tax demands or the military demands of the Ottomans, they were allowed to govern and rule themselves. And they had direct representation to the Sultan. So the Ottomans were tolerant. And the Safavids were tolerant to some degree towards outsiders. They were not tolerant towards Sunni Muslims. So they mandated that everyone be Shia. So they were intolerant in that sense, but Chinese or other artisans or merchants who came in were tolerated because they wanted to expand trade. Okay, so let's shift to China and Japan. And remember that the Chinese are coming out of Mongol occupation. And so the Ming Dynasty establishes itself and tries to reinvigorate the Confucian ideals that had gone before. So they reestablish the civil service examination and expand the education system to get a meritocracy, a skilled bureaucracy. Early on in the Ming Empire, they're briefly interested in exploration, and the Ming exploration predates the Europeans. So the Chinese are exploring before the Europeans do. And under the Emperor Mongol, he sponsors Zheng He, an admiral, to take 7 voyages throughout the Indian Ocean. The goal and the purpose of these voyages is to establish tributary relationships with surrounding states for China, and also to reestablish China's supremacy in the region and kind of establish themselves as a regional power. These voyages are successful in terms of establishing tributary relationships, but they're not really profitable. So after the emperor's death, the Chinese abandon that policy and kind of have a reversal, and they destroy a lot of the records. One theory about why they abandoned the policy is that the Mongols have formed a new confederation, and they're starting to deal with invasions and threats on their northern border. And so they've got to use the resources of the government for defense. And they rebuild parts of the Great Wall in response to that conflict. The Ming were not technologically innovative. So this is the time period in Chinese history when they're falling behind. And this is the time period when the Europeans are kind of coming into the forefront of technological innovation. So that influences the relationship between the Ming and the Europeans, and it comes in the form of the Jesuits. So when the Jesuits come to China, as they're going all over the globe trying to combat the Reformation, the Ming emperors allow the Jesuits to come into court, allow them to try to talk about their religion, because they're primarily interested in the scientific advances and knowledge of the Europeans, which the Jesuits have, because they themselves are also highly educated. So at first, there is a positive relationship there. The trading relationship between the Ming and the Europeans is similar to the trading relationship that was happening before with the Han and later dynasties. Essentially, the Chinese are interested in selling their luxury items, but they want to be a self-sufficient Confucian economy, so they don't want to have any imports. So they don't really want to buy anything from the Europeans. However, in this time period, they become very interested in European silver, and so they are willing to exchange their porcelain, their silk, their tea for European silver. The Ming ultimately become so fond of silver that they start to experience inflationary problems as a result of the influx. The Ming will also suffer agricultural decline when there's a climate change, a mini ice age that takes place. And lastly, the Ming will have difficulty because they will try to protect the Korean Peninsula against an invasion by the Japanese during the time period of unification. All of these things combined will lead to significant weakening of the Ming dynasty, and the Ming will be replaced by the Qing, a foreign dynasty from Manchuria, the region just north of China. So when the Qing come in, they come in under the guise of helping the Ming put down the peasant revolts that are happening because of the agricultural crisis. But what they do instead is they take over control of the government. So the Qing will basically establish a Confucian bureaucracy and continue the policies of the Ming, and they will staff Chinese in the government. However, they will separate themselves in terms of social status, and they don't allow intermarriage. And so the Qing will be above the indigenous Chinese, and they will primarily be in the military. The Ching Dynasty, though, particularly under leaders like Emperor Kangxi, established a very efficient bureaucracy. They get rid of some of the corruption that had set in during the time period of the Ming. They become more efficient with their revenue collection. And so Emperor Kangxi is actually able to lower the taxes of the peasant. And the Qing are going to greatly expand the territory and have a period of peace and prosperity. The relationship with the Europeans during the time period of the Qing will get worse. The Qing will establish the Canton system, which is a more restrictive trading system than the Ming had, where they're only going to allow the Europeans to come into one port city, and trade is going to be highly regulated and controlled. The Chinese were starting to become concerned about the gunboat diplomacy they were seeing the Europeans exercise in other parts of the Indian Ocean. The Qing also turn on the Jesuits. So while the Qing had the same policy as the Ming initially with respect to wanting to engage with the Jesuits to learn about Western technology, the Pope issued an edict at a certain point that reprimanded the Jesuits in China for talking about Confucianism and for endorsing ancestral worship. And so basically the Pope issued an edict sort of against Confucianism, and that led to the Jesuits being ousted from China later on in the Qing Dynasty. But that all is happening at the same time as increasing tensions are occurring between the Europeans and the Chinese over trade. So you kind of got all of that happening at once. Okay, I'm going to check for questions real quick, and then we're going to talk about Japan. You're asking about silver influx in the Gunpowder Empires. Same issue. So the Europeans were trading with the Middle East as well as with China, and they were exchanging silver for the items that they wanted to buy in the Middle East. Okay, let's talk a little bit about the Tokugawa. So you can kind of see Japan over here on the right. Japan, when we left the last unit, was feudal, so politically decentralized. And what's happening over the first 150 years of this time period is that the most powerful warlords, the daimyo, are warring with one another to secure control of as much territory as possible. Ultimately, there's three, and then there's one. And so the Tokugawa shogunate is able to militarily defeat rival daimyo, and they're able to establish centralized control in Japan. The Japanese will, because they've already accepted Confucian influence, establish a centralized bureaucracy that is modeled on the Confucian bureaucracy in China. The Tokugawa shogunate, though, is also a military dictatorship because the leader is a military commander. The Tokugawa will try to control the power of the nobility by establishing policies like alternate attendance, requiring the daimyo to spend a lot of time in the capital city, kind of similar to how Louis XIV made the nobles spend a lot of time at Versailles, so you keep an eye on them. For a time period, Japan really flourished under the Tokugawa's rule because there wasn't a lot of warfare going on. So the Pax Tokugawa, if you will, or the peaceful period of time, then leads to population growth in Japan, which becomes problematic. Japan does not have a lot of farmable land, and it can't sustain a large population. And so the population pressures led to agricultural shortfalls. There wasn't enough food. Taxes went up. The peasants are being taxed in rice, and so increasing demand for greater and greater percentages of what they produce to be able to feed the bureaucracy and to support the nobles resulted in peasant uprisings and rebellions. Another problem that the Tokugawa had was that they were trying to maintain a Confucian ideal, but in reality they were heavily dependent upon trade, and their rice-based agricultural economy wasn't working. So everyone was getting paid in rice, and then the daimyo and the samurai were having to take that rice to the silver exchanges where the merchants were controlling the terms of trade. And so the daimyo were not able to sustain their lifestyle. They fell farther and farther into debt to the merchants, who are disfavored in a Confucian system, but who were becoming increasingly wealthy and more powerful. And so Japan, by the end of this time period, is a country in crisis. And the next unit we're going to get into, we're going to see revolution take place in Japan and the overthrow of the shogunate. It's important to remember that Japan, though, is also a producer of silver. So there are silver mines in Japan, just as there are silver mines in South America and in Mesoamerica. So initially, the Japanese are also supplying silver as part of this network of trade, and they're trading with China as well for items like silk and porcelain. Okay, so let me go back here. China also at the beginning had a tax on grain, on rice, but China converted to a silver economy, which was problematic. As China developed its fondness for silver, they then started making the peasants pay taxes in silver, which the peasants didn't have. And the amount of silver they had to pay was based on the amount of rice or grain they produced. So the peasants started to produce deliberately less and less food because they couldn't afford to pay the tax. So that created, in the Ming Dynasty, contributed to the agricultural shortfall that they were experiencing. Okay, so have I left anything out? Is there anything else you have questions about or you want me to cover? Oh, okay, Ben. So initially, the Portuguese arrived in Japan as the first Europeans to arrive, just like they were the first to arrive in China. And the Japanese initially allowed for trade with the Portuguese, and they were interested in the firearms that the Portuguese have, and so they allowed the Jesuit missionaries to come in. Over time, they became concerned about the actions of the missionaries. There was pretty widespread conversion amongst the peasant classes to Christianity. And when the peasant rebellion started, they blamed the Christians. And so they wanted to oust the Portuguese. However, they wanted to continue to get information about European technology. So they preferred to trade with the Dutch. So the Dutch actually helped the Japanese militarily oust the Portuguese, and the Dutch were allowed, and they were the only Europeans allowed to trade with the Japanese at the port city of Nagasaki. Shani asked about Calvinism. So Calvinism is basically a Protestant notion of salvation by faith, but they also add to their concept the concept of predestination. So the idea that you're either saved or you're damned the day you're born and there's nothing you can do about it. And what that typically accompanies is a strong work ethic and a pretty conservative and lifestyle because you think you're amongst the chosen. Christine is asking why the Pope was upset with the Jesuits, because the Jesuits were in China endorsing Confucianism and endorsing ancestral worship, and the Pope is a true believer in Christianity, and those things are not the same. And so he felt that they weren't being true to the faith. And then when the Pope spoke out against Confucianism, that, of course, offended and upset the Chinese. So Luke is asking about the Dutch spice trade in the East Indies. So, you know, what you want to know is that the Portuguese were first, then the Dutch were second to arrive to try to dominate trade in the Indian Ocean, and then the British were third. So not a lot of detail, but you want to know about the motivations of the Europeans in the Indian Ocean. Triangular trade was the trade between the Europeans, so between Europe, the Europeans took manufactured goods to Africa. They bought gold, they bought slaves. The slaves were then transported to the Americas. In the Americas, they got sugar, and then they started to make rum from the runoff byproduct of sugarcane cultivation. Then that rum was shipped back to Europe along with the sugar. Yeah, I'll post this PowerPoint. I actually have a better version of it that goes through the standards, so I'll post that. What did Peter the Great do to westernize Russia? So he first established a capital city at St. Petersburg, so he would have a warm water port on the Baltic Sea, so he could engage in trade with the West. He established a bureaucracy that was based on merit. He used the table of ranks, and he pushed the nobles kind of out of power and integrated more the middle class into his centralized bureaucracy. He brought the church under state control, much like the European monarchs had done in the Reformation. He promoted education and established an education system that was focused on science and technology. He actually established the first newspaper in Russia to expand literacy. So he greatly modeled, he even insisted that the people dress in Western style, that the men shaved their beards to look like the Western Europeans. And so that was his focus. Okay, questions are going fast. She's asking about the African slave trade and King Alfonso. So King Alfonso, I can't remember, do we read an excerpt of that in class? He was a king of the Congo region, and the Congo region and King Alfonso actually converted to Christianity. And so they established a trading relationship with the Portuguese and the slave trade. Over time, King Alfonso became frustrated with what he felt were the unethical actions of the European traders. And so he tried to make an appeal to the Portuguese king to get him to stop that behavior. So King Alfonso was kind of standing up against the Europeans and their actions as they gained more, as they tried to gain more influence in Africa. So Indian Ocean trade, that's all of it, right? That's what we've been talking about in terms of the Europeans wanting the luxury items from the Indian Ocean, that their goods were not being traded, that essentially they were only wanting to have European silver. So what ended up happening was largely that the Europeans kind of became the middlemen, right? Carrying silver, gaining buying products from China, taking those products to the Southeast Asian islands, going to India, and they kind of became the middlemen in the exchange. But essentially, it's the luxury items that have always been demanded in the Indian Ocean, and it's the Europeans exchanging New World silver. I don't ask you about any specific, really, African empires. You've got the coastal kingdoms that are engaging in the slave trade during this time period. And then the only other internal African kingdom is the Songhai Kingdom, which is, remember we learned about Ghana and Mali. Songhai is the kingdom that's now dominating the trans-Saharan gold salt trade. Pope's relationship with the Ottoman Empire. There was conflict. There was conflict because the Ottomans were trying to conquer Eastern Europe. First, the American civilizations, the Mayan are the classical civilizations, the classical civilization of Mesoamerica. The Incan and the Aztecs are the civilizations that are there when the Europeans arrive. Warfare during absolutism was both. But, fundamentally, warfare is always about power. And so one of the problems in Europe was that the Holy Roman Emperors were from the Habsburg family, Austria. And the Habsburg family had lots of relatives in other monarchies. So the Habsburgs gained a lot of power. So at one point, Charles V, who was the Holy Roman Emperor, was also the King of Spain. And so some of the wars that were fought, quote unquote, in the name of religion, and the Habsburg were Catholic, were not so much about Catholics versus Protestants, but were more about limiting the power of the Habsburgs. But there was also a lot of conflict between the Protestants and the Catholics during this time period as well. There's not really a war between Protestants and Catholics in England. What happened in England was Henry VIII used the Reformation to get a divorce and to increase his power, and so he became Protestant. His daughter, who came to the throne, Mary, tried to reestablish Catholicism, and that created conflict. And then when she died, his daughter Mary restored Protestantism. And so there was kind of this back and forth in terms of what was going to be the official religion of the English people, but ultimately it became Protestant. And okay. All right, so I think we're just about good. The Battle of Calderon, no, you don't need to know that by name. That's the battle between. That's one of the seminal battles between the Ottomans and the Safavids. But I think if you saw it in a question, you would know what it was about. All right, guys. I think I'm about to sign off. Are there any last questions? Okay. I want your feedback tomorrow on what you think about this, because it's weird for me not to see you or hear you. All right, guys, I'll see everybody tomorrow, okay? Take care.